Martin Luther King became a household name. And it led to a series of other protests. So there, what some of the things that were common. This is a picture of sit-ins. This is a pretty famous picture. So students, and it was mostly college students that would be involved. Not always all black. Notice the picture. They would go and sit at locations that still had segregated counters, lunch counters, and so they would just sit there with a black person, and oftentimes they would gather crowds that were not happy about what was going on. Now, this young lady right here is Jean Mulholland. And Jean Mulholland was a freedom rider. She was very active in the civil rights movement and civil rights protests, and she just happens to be the first non-black member of my sorority. My sorority is Delta Sigma Theta, and she is a member of Delta Sigma Theta. She was down for the cause, and we're very, very proud to have her as a member. These young people are getting ready for a ride along. They would get onto Greyhound buses that also had a desegregation policy. And the buses, and basically sit anywhere they wanted to on the bus. And it would make people angry, and people would show up when they were getting ready to go on. There were protests. There were people throwing Molotov cocktails. I know of at least one person was killed, and it was simply because the young people were trying to end the discrimination policy, or policy that they thought was unfair. Oftentimes, the demonstrations would bring out law enforcement. They would bring out fire departments, and there are some pretty famous photos of fire departments turning water hoses on young people, police dogs attacking young people, and everybody was trained not to react. It was called um, basically peaceful demonstrations, and they were trained not to react. And these made for some powerful images. When we talk about the media, just think about how that looked to people that were not there, to people in the North, to people in other countries. It was like, how can you be that cruel? How can you um, how can it be such a big deal to you that you are willing to turn fire hoses on kids, and to let dogs attack or seem to attack children, and take people to jail? Good heavens, how many times did John Lewis go to jail? He went to jail just about every large city that he went through as he was doing his participating in sit-ins, and he did ride-alongs as well. This is a picture of the March on Washington. This is a very narrow shot, or is this Selma? This may be marching over the bridge in Selma, Bloody Sunday. So the Civil Rights Act was huge, and it was sweeping. It addressed a little bit about voting discrimination, but not. It was not very specific. Was not very specific. So in we had the Civil Rights Act that was passed in 1964, or signed by the president in 1964. The 24th Amendment had been winding its way through. It had received 2/3 vote in Congress, and then 3/4 of the states had approved it, and so the 24th Amendment outlawed poll taxes. Then in 1966, the Supreme Court banned literacy tests. But remember that the Reconstruction Amendments, 13th Amendment, which abolished slavery, the 14th Amendment, which gave guaranteed due process and equal protection of the laws, and the 15th Amendment, which gave the right to vote to people regardless of their previous condition of servitude or their color. But Southern states in general had been allowed to, as part of their Jim Crow systems, write in voting restrictions. So some of them were on the books, some of them were more subtle, like they would just close the office when people came to vote. But in general, states were doing all kinds of little odd things. Texas had a white only primary, and so Democrats were basically running things, and the primary is where you decide who is going to actually be the candidate. Well, many states, Texas included, had laws that said only whites could vote in the primaries. You could vote in the general election, but you couldn't vote in the primaries. If you wanted to register to vote, you had to pay some money. Registration or a poll tax would happen in January, and you had to register every year. Some states had what are called literacy tests, where you had to pass a test, a written test usually, to be able to register to vote, and the questions that were asked were different. Some states were seeing that this was also affecting whites, and it was certainly meant to address blacks voting, which was a big fear, because blacks usually have African Americans have a tendency to vote in large blocks. We can talk some more later about why this is, but vote in blocks, and it increases voting power, and it was freaking the leaders that had gotten used to the status quo, traditional, it was freaking them out. So they were trying to figure out ways to keep African Americans from voting. Literacy test, grandfather clause. So if your grandfather could vote before 1865, which was the last year of the Civil War, then you can vote. Good moral character clauses. The basically the registrar could decide whether or not you were a good moral character and would let you register to vote if you were, and you couldn't register to vote if they wouldn't certify that. There were a myriad of things that were going on that were meant to disenfranchise African Americans. So little by little, these things were being knocked down, either through constitutional amendment, through Supreme Court decisions, or through the Voting Rights Act of 1965. So the Voting Rights Act of 1965 basically set up the federal government as a watchdog and an overseer of state election laws and practices and redistricting. So if you were a state that had a history of one particular group, and at first it was only African Americans, that was certainly expanded over time, but at first it was only African Americans. So if you have a population of African Americans and less than 50% of the vote, those that are eligible to vote, are voting, then you went onto this list. And I think I've talked about it before, but I'm just going to reiterate that the Voting Rights Act put states like Mississippi, Georgia, Alabama. It was mostly southern states in 1965 that went on this list. And so if you were on the list, you were going to have government oversight, Justice Department oversight, and they would assign federal judges to look at your voting laws, to look at your maps when you redistricted, um, and tell you whether or not that was going to have a disproportionate effect on African Americans. In 1975, Texas was added to the list, not because of the voting uh, population, the voting numbers of African Americans, voting percentages of African Americans, but because the percentage of Hispanics, which the Civil Rights Act was expanded to include, was so low. So Texas was added. States like South Dakota were added because of their percentage of natives in their states were so low. So there were some states that were added because there was evidence of discrimination in voting and voting registration of a suspect class, mainly someone that was of a race or class or national origin that had traditionally experienced discrimination. And so that really went on. The Voting Rights Act is still good law, but in 2013, in a case that was brought really technically by the state of Alabama, Shelby County. Shelby County is a county in Alabama, and Texas Attorney General joined this suit. Holder in this case was Eric Holder, who was the Attorney General of under Barack Obama, and they sued and said, you're holding us to this standard and putting everything that we're doing under scrutiny based on numbers from 1965 and formulas from 1965. So there is no proof that this discrimination is still going on. And so how can you just continue to renew and continue to restrict us based on 1965 principles? Now, mind you, they offered absolutely no numbers to show that if the restrictions ended, that there would not be. And I mean, how can you? But what the Supreme Court did was said not knock down the Voting Rights Act, but they did say Congress is going to have to come up with a different formula for deciding who is going to be under voting rights restrictions, this automatic review. And so when they did that, they basically said until Congress does that, there will be no automatic review. And when I tell you that states have been off to the races, passing all kinds of stuff, or all kinds of laws that may be found to be discriminatory, and with this Supreme Court may not. And just kind of holding their breath and proceeding with acts that are clearly or very apparently discriminatory, hoping that they'll get through this next voting cycle before somebody says, yeah, you can't do that. And for the most part, the Supreme Court, when they get these cases, they're going, the state can decide. Y'all do what y'all want to do. Kind of like they did in 1897. Y'all do what you want to do. Also under Lyndon Johnson was the Civil Rights Act of 1968, also known as the Fair Housing Act. This addressed specifically some of the redlining issues that I was talking to you about before. Let's see if this video plays.
Home ownership, the means by which most Americans begin to generate familial wealth. Unbeknownst to most, there was this little big thing called redlining, which was engaged in by the U.S. government, local realtors, and lenders in determining who got to realize this so-called American dream. What's redlining, you ask? Picture a classroom full of students that are prepping for an exam that they must pass in order to get to the next grade. 85% of the students get to come into class every day, are given extra materials to go over, and can meet with the teachers to make sure they understand everything on the test. The remaining 15% get no assistance from the school whatsoever. By the time the test comes around, who do you think has an overwhelmingly better chance of getting to the next level? That, my friends, is how redlining works. In the 1930s, the Homeowners Loan Corporation, HOLC, joined together with local lenders and realtors and set out to evaluate the mortgage lending risk of 239 cities across the U.S. When the HOLC evaluated the cities, they attached letter grades A through D to neighborhoods based on a myriad of factors, with race being the preeminent one. Black areas systemically scored poorly, white areas scored well. According to the U.S., they were solely looking to loan capital to areas that were considered strong and potential of returning that investment. Yet, at the same time, they also claimed to be guarding against, and I quote, the infiltration of foreign-born, Negro, and lower-grade populations. For 20 years, between the 1930s and 50s, 3/5 of homes purchased were financed by the FHA. Realize, of that number, 2% of FHA loans went to non-white home buyers. Redlining was practiced en masse from the 1930s to the 1970s. Just to realize how ridiculous this situation was, go and research the Burwood Wall, a 6-foot-high cement wall built in 8 Mile, Detroit that split the black area from the white area. Once the developers created this wall, the U.S. government agreed to fund their project. If you take a look at the historic redline maps of cities across America, and then take a look at the neighborhoods within those cities, there's no question, the evaluators were visionaries, whether for good or for worse. To this day, those neighborhoods still represent the most poverty-stricken areas in all of America.
So the Civil Rights Act of 1968 prohibited redlining. And just as the video just said, this was a refusal to give mortgages for homes in certain neighborhoods, primarily those with large black populations. Today, 2020, there are still strong patterns of housing segregation. African Americans and Hispanics still have more difficulty obtaining mortgages than whites of comparable income levels and even comparable credit scores. There have been several. I know that Countrywide was sued because they were denying African Americans and Hispanics in larger numbers, and it really kind of seemed like it was based solely on their name, but they were denying more loans, even, and this was 2011 or so that suit was heard. This is a red line map of the city of Austin. Here's the legend. Green was best. Blue was still desirable. Yellow was definitely declining. And red was hazardous. If you know anything about Austin, and I know a little, Eastern Austin was the area of town where a lot of African Americans lived. And notice that it is red lined, hazardous. So you were not going to be able to get a loan to live in that house, to live in that area. You were going to have to find other means, which also made the area, made the house values in the area very low. Now, this is a really good example and a very clear example, because some maps are really hard to read, but a very clear example of the Home Loan Corporation red line maps. And it was widespread. So this concludes this section.